soot coated the back of her throat like cheap flour. Clara adjusted her grip on the sleeping toddler in her left arm, her right hand white-knuckled around a battered leather grip. 2,000 miles of iron rails had eaten her last dime. She stood on the warped planks of a Wyoming depot with twin 3-year-olds waiting for a man she knew only from a badly spelled letter. He wanted a wife. He didn't know about the children. The train's steam whistle cut off with a wet, choking hiss. Brakes squealed against iron rails, a sound that drove straight into the base of Clara's skull and stayed there. She stepped down from the passenger car, her boots hitting the splintered planks of the Oakhaven depot with a hollow thud. Willa was a dead weight against her left shoulder, radiating a low-grade fever that seeped through Clara's thin wool coat. Sam, clutching the hem of her skirt, was crying. He wasn't screaming, just emitting a continuous exhausted whimper that smelled of stale milk and soot. Clara didn't try to shush him. She barely had the breath to fill her own lungs. The air here was different than in Chicago. It was thin, razor-sharp, and tasted of dust and dry sage. She set her single leather grip down on the platform. The handles were worn smooth from nervous sweat. Inside were 2 spare dresses, a tin of talcum powder, 6 cloth diapers, a Bible, and a sewing kit. That was the sum total of her existence. Around her, the platform emptied. A few ranchers in canvas dusters collected crates of machine parts. A woman in a dark blue traveling suit was met by a man with a neat mustache who tipped his hat and took her elbow. Clara watched them walk away, a bitter pang of envy tightening her chest. She looked down at the letter in her pocket. The paper was soft and fraying at the creases from how many times she had unfolded it. I own a good piece of land. I need a woman who knows how to keep a house and don't mind quiet. Enclosed is the ticket. Signed, Josiah Miller. 10 minutes passed. The locomotive detached from the passenger cars and chugged down the spur line to take on water, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. The afternoon sun beat down on Clara's dark wool dress, drawing sweat at her collarbone, but the wind cutting across the tracks carried a bitter, biting chill. "You, Clara," the voice came from behind her. Clara turned, hoisting Willa slightly higher on her hip. Josiah Miller was a man of medium build, with a posture that suggested he believed he was much taller. He wore a reasonably clean broadcloth shirt and a vest that strained slightly over a soft stomach. His face wasn't cruel, but it was set in the permanent pinched expression of a man who always felt he was being overcharged. He carried the faint scent of bay rum, stale sweat, and cheap cigars. Clara forced her shoulders back. She swallowed the grit in her throat. "I am. Mr. Miller." Josiah didn't answer right away. His eyes, pale, watery brown, dropped from her face. They slid over the frayed cuffs of her sleeves, the dust caked on her boots. And then, finally, they stopped on the 2 small bodies clinging to her. The silence stretched. The wind rattled a loose tin sign on the side of the depot building. "What in the hell is this?" Josiah asked. His voice was quiet, but it had the flat, dangerous edge of a struck match. "These are my children," Clara said. Her voice wavered just for a second before she locked her jaw. "Sam and Willa." Josiah stared at her. A flush of dark red crept up from his collar. He took a step back, as if she had suddenly revealed a contagious disease. "You didn't say nothing about kids in your letters. You didn't ask," Clara said. It was a weak defense, and she knew it. She had deliberately omitted them. She had known no man looking for cheap labor, and a warm bed through the mail would pay freight for another man's brats. It had been a desperate gamble forged in the suffocating heat of a Chicago tenement where the rent was overdue and the cholera was creeping up the stairs. "I didn't ask." Josiah repeated a harsh bark of a laugh escaping his throat. He took off his bowler hat, wiped his sweating forehead with his sleeve, and slapped the hat back onto his head. I ask for a plough. I don't ask if it comes with 2 broken wheels. I assumed I was dealing with an honest woman. I am honest, Clara said, the desperation finally leaking into her tone. Sam, sensing the tension, began to cry louder, burying his dirty face in her skirt. Mr. Miller, they eat very little. I can work, I can cook, I can mend, I can tend a garden. You won't even know they're there. I won't know they're there. Josiah pointed a thick, calloused finger at Sam. The boy's wailing like a stuck calf right now. I ain't running an orphanage. I paid for a wife. I paid good money for that train ticket. I didn't pay for another man's leavings. The insult hit Clara like a physical blow. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and cold despite the sun. My husband died of consumption. I am a widow, not a strumpet. Makes no difference to me. Josiah spat. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a plug of dark tobacco, and bit off a corner, his eyes never leaving her face. He chewed for a moment, the muscles in his jaw rolling. Deal's off. Clara stopped breathing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the dusty street and the false front buildings of Oakhaven swirling together in a sickening blur. You can't, she whispered. I just did, Josiah said. I have no money. I have 14 cents to my name. I don't know anyone here. Where am I supposed to go? Josiah spat a stream of dark juice onto the dirt just inches from the toes of her boots. That sounds like a problem you brought on yourself, widow. Maybe the church will take you in. Or maybe you can find work down at the saloon. I hear they're always looking for women who ain't too particular. He turned on his heel. Wait! Clara screamed it, the sound tearing out of her throat, raw and ugly. She reached out her fingers, brushing the rough fabric of his vest. Please, just for a week, let me work off the ticket. Josiah jerked away from her touch, his lip curling in disgust. Don't touch me. You're lucky I don't drag you to the sheriff for fraud. He didn't look back. Clara stood paralyzed, watching him walk away down the boardwalk, his boots thudding a steady rhythmic retreat until he turned a corner and disappeared. The wind picked up, swirling a small dust devil around her ankles. Willa shifted in her arms, letting out a hot, miserable sigh. Clara looked down at the 14 cents resting at the bottom of her coat pocket. She was 2,000 miles from a home that no longer existed, standing on a splintered platform with 2 starving children, and the sun was beginning to drop behind the mountains. Gideon Hayes pulled the rough hemp rope tight over the canvas tarp, the coarse fibers biting into the calluses of his palms. He tied it off with a sharp, practiced jerk, securing the 100 pounds of flour, the 50 pounds of salt, and the crates of winter ammunition in the bed of his wagon. He hated town. He hated the smell of it, a sour mix of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and too many people breathing the same air. He hated the noise, the clatter of wagon wheels, the shouting of merchants, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. It all scraped against his nerves like a dull file. He came down from the high ridges, twice a year, once in the spring, to sell pelts, and once in the late autumn, to buy the heavy provisions that couldn't be hunted or trapped. The frost was already hardening the ground above the timberline. In 2 weeks the pass would be buried in snow, and he wouldn't see another human face until the thaw. That suited him just fine. He leaned against the heavy wooden wheel of his wagon, pulling a wrinkled tin from his coat pocket. He rolled a cigarette with slow, deliberate movements, his large, scarred fingers surprisingly deft. He struck a match off the heel of his boot, cupped his hands around the flame, and inhaled the sharp, dark smoke of the tobacco. It was then He heard the voices from the depot across the street. Gideon didn't make a habit of watching other people's misery. A man stayed alive in the territory by keeping his eyes on his own boots and his hands near his iron. But the sharp, desperate pitch of the woman's voice cut through the ambient noise of the street. He watched through the haze of his cigarette smoke. He recognized Josiah Miller. Everyone knew Miller. He ran the hardware store, squeezed pennies until they bled and drank quietly and meanly in the back room of the saloon on Sundays. Gideon watched the exchange. He couldn't hear every word over the wind, but he didn't need to. The body language spoke volumes. The woman's rigid spine, the frantic shifting of the heavy toddler on her hip, the smaller child burying its face in her skirts. Miller's dismissive, ugly posture. When Miller turned and walked away, Gideon waited. He expected the woman to break. He expected her to drop to the planks and weep. He had seen it before, the sudden crushing realization of the frontier breaking the spirit of Easterners in real time. But she didn't fall. Through the dust blowing across the street, Gideon watched her slowly lower the child from her hip. She knelt down, putting herself at eye level with the screaming boy. She didn't shake him. She didn't yell. She just pulled him into her chest, wrapping her arms around both children, burying her face in the boy's dirty hair. She stayed like that for a long time, just a dark, shivering mass of wool on the edge of the frontier. Gideon took another drag of his cigarette. The smoke tasted like ash. He looked away, staring up at the jagged peaks of the mountains looming over the town. The sky above them was turning a bruised, violent purple. Up there, his cabin sat empty. It had been empty for 3 years. 3 years since the fever took Cora. 3 years since he had buried her and the stillborn infant in the frozen ground beneath the pines. He had learned to live with the silence. He had convinced himself it was peace. But on nights when the wind howled down the chimney, the silence wasn't empty. It was a physical weight pressing against his ribs, ringing in his ears, until he thought he might go mad from the sheer lack of another human heartbeat. He looked back at the woman. She was standing up now, picking up her worn leather bag. She looked left, then right. There was nowhere to go. Gideon dropped his cigarette into the dirt and crushed it under his boot. He swore softly, a harsh, guttural sound, angry at himself, angry at Miller, angry at the world that let children freeze on train platforms. He pushed off the wagon wheel and crossed the street. His boots made heavy, deliberate sounds on the boardwalk. As he approached, the woman snapped her head toward him. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot from coal dust and unshed tears. She took a step back, pulling the children behind her legs. Up close, Gideon saw the dark circles under her eyes, the sharp, hollow cut of her cheekbones. She was young, maybe 25, but exhaustion had aged her. "He ain't coming back," Gideon said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, unused to quiet conversation. The woman stiffened. "I didn't ask for your opinion." Her voice trembled, but her chin came up. Pride. Useless, stupid pride. "Wasn't offering an opinion, was stating a fact," Gideon said. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the kids. The girl was shivering violently, her lips taking on a faint blue tinge. The boy was staring at Gideon's heavy leather coat with wide, fearful eyes. "Miller's a cheap bastard. You're well rid of him." Gideon continued shifting his weight. He smelled of horse sweat, pine tar and wood smoke. "But that don't solve your immediate problem." "I don't have a problem," Clara lied, her voice cracking. I'll find a boarding house." "With what?" Gideon asked flatly. "Town's full. Cattle buyers took the last rooms at the hotel. Boarding house wants a week's pay up front. You got money." Clara's throat worked. She looked away, staring at the rusted iron of the train tracks. No. Gideon let the silence hang for a moment. He listened to the wind whistling through the telegraph wires. He hated what he was about to do. It was reckless. It was a complication. But looking at the blue lips on the little girl, he knew if he walked away, he'd see their faces in the embers of his stove all winter. "I got a cabin," Gideon said. The words felt like gravel in his mouth. 3 hours up the ridge. It ain't pretty. It's built of mud and logs. I run trap lines. I'm gone from sunup to sundown. Clara looked back at him, her eyes narrowing with sudden, sharp suspicion. She pulled the children tighter against her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need someone to salt meat. I need someone to keep the stove hot so I don't come back to a frozen house. I need someone to mend clothes and bake bread." Gideon met her eyes squarely. There was no warmth in his gaze, just a cold, practical assessment. "You need a roof. You need food for those pups. You come up the mountain, you do the work, you stay warm. That's the deal." Clara stared at him. She looked at his massive shoulders, the thick beard obscuring half his face, the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He looked like the wilderness itself, rough, unforgiving, dangerous. "You want me to be your wife?" She asked the word, tasting like bile. "I had a wife," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, a sudden dangerous softness entering his tone. "I don't want another one. I don't want a warm bed. I want a housekeeper, a business arrangement. Nothing more." Clara looked down at Willa. The child's teeth were beginning to chatter. The wind whipped Clara's skirt around her ankles, a biting reminder of the coming night. Josiah Miller had abandoned her. The town didn't know her. The man standing in front of her was a stranger who looked like a bear offering her a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was terrifying, but it was a door. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Gideon," he replied. He reached down and effortlessly picked up her heavy leather grip in one hand. "Wagons across the street. Let's go before the sun drops." The wagon seat was a slab of raw oak that offered zero forgiveness. Every rut, every frozen clod of mud on the trail transferred directly into Clara's spine. She sat rigid, her arms locked around the twins, who were huddled together under a massive, scratchy wool blanket Gideon had tossed them from the back. The blanket smelled powerfully of wet dog and old sweat, but it trapped the heat, and within 20 minutes, both children had mercifully passed out. Gideon sat beside her, driving the heavy draft mules, huge, ugly beasts he called Barnaby and Clementine. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. His attention was entirely on the narrow, winding trail that cut its way up the side of the mountain. His hands gripping the thick leather reins were covered in fine, pale scars. The town of Oak Haven disappeared below them, swallowed by the rolling foothills and the gathering dusk. As they climbed, the landscape changed. The scrub oak and dusty sagebrush gave way to towering ponderosa pines. The air grew thinner, sharper. It smelled of resin-crushed pine needles and the deep metallic scent of impending snow. With the change in elevation came a brutal drop in temperature. Clara felt the cold seeping through the soles of her boots, creeping up her calves. She shivered, pulling the collar of her coat up around her neck. Next to her, Gideon reached into a canvas sack at his feet without taking his eyes off the trail. He pulled out a dark, irregular chunk of something and held it out to her. Clara looked at it. "What is it?" "Dried venison," Gideon said. "Chew on it. Keeps the jaw moving, keeps the blood flowing. Helps with the cold." Clara took it. It was hard as wood and heavily salted. She bit off a small piece and worked it between her back teeth. It tasted of smoke and blood a raw, primal flavor that made her stomach turn over, but she forced herself to swallow. It did help. The sheer effort of chewing provided a strange distraction from the freezing air. "How much further?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin and lost in the vast, roaring silence of the pines. "An hour," Gideon said. "Hold on. Trail gets rough here." He wasn't lying. The wagon lurched violently as the wheels hit an outcrop of granite. Clara slammed against Gideon's shoulder. It felt like hitting a brick wall. She mumbled an apology, but he didn't acknowledge it. He just clicked his tongue at the mules urging them higher. The darkness fell fast, not like the slow, creeping twilight of the plains, but like a heavy curtain dropping over the mountains. The shadows beneath the trees turned pitch black. Clara's imagination began to populate the darkness, with wolves, with bears, with men worse than Josiah Miller. She looked at the giant of a man beside her. She had willingly climbed into a wagon with a stranger who was now taking her miles away from civilization. The sheer insanity of her decision washed over her, bringing a fresh wave of nausea. But then she felt Willa's chest rising and falling rhythmically against her side. Her breathing was easier. The fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't spiked either. Survival. It was always just about the next few hours. Finally, the trees broke. The mules dragged the wagon into a small, uneven clearing carved out of the side of the mountain. "Whoa!" Gideon rumbled. The wagon groaned and came to a halt. Clara peered through the gloom. At the far edge of the clearing stood a cabin. It was low and squat, built of massive, unpeeled logs, chinked with pale mud. The roof was heavy sod, currently dusted with a fine layer of white frost. There were no windows on the front, just a heavy plank door. It looked less like a home, and more like a fortress built to withstand a siege. It was the loneliest place Clara had ever seen. "Stay here," Gideon ordered. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down. Clara watched him walk to the door, slide a heavy iron latch, and push it open. He disappeared inside. A moment later, the flare of a sulfur match illuminated the dark interior, followed by the soft yellow glow of a kerosene lamp. Gideon emerged, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Bring 'em in." Clara tried to stand, but her legs were stiff from the cold and the brutal ride. Her knees buckled slightly as she stepped down from the wagon bed. She managed to catch herself against the wheel, gasping as the freezing air hit the sweat that had dried on her back. She turned to the wagon, reaching for the sleeping children. Gideon was suddenly there. He didn't ask. He just reached past her, his massive hands easily scooping up both Sam and Willa, wrapping the heavy blanket around them. They looked impossibly small against his broad chest. "Grab your bag," he said, turning toward the cabin. Clara grabbed her grip and followed him. Stepping through the doorway, she was hit by the smell of the place. It was a dense, layered scent. Stale wood ash, oiled leather, dried herbs, animal tallow, and an overwhelming, heavy cold that seemed to radiate from the logs themselves. The interior was one large room. In the center sat a massive cast-iron stove. To the left, a rough-hewn table and 2 stumps that served as chairs. To the right, a series of shelves holding canned goods sacks of flour and trapping equipment. In the far corner was a bed frame made of stripped pine branches covered by a thick, dark bear pelt. A wooden ladder led up to a small, dark loft under the eaves. It was immaculately clean, but completely devoid of softness. There were no curtains, no rugs, no pictures. It was a place designed solely for survival. Gideon laid the children down on the bed. They didn't wake, merely shifted and burrowed into the thick fur of the pelt. Clara stood awkwardly by the door, her bag clutched in both hands. She was shivering violently now, her teeth clicking together. Gideon didn't look at her. He walked to the stove, opened the cast-iron door, and began feeding kindling into the belly. He struck another match. The dry wood caught instantly, the flames crackling loud in the silent room. Stove takes a while to heat the logs, but it'll get warm soon, Gideon said, keeping his back to her as he adjusted the damper. Pump is out back if you need water. Outhouse is 50 yards to the left of the door. Don't go out without a lantern. There's cougars on the ridge. Clara swallowed hard. Where will you sleep? Gideon closed the stove door with a metallic clank. He stood up, towering over her in the dim light of the cabin. He pointed to the ladder. Loft. You and the pups take the bed. He walked past her, grabbed his rifle from the corner, and picked up a wooden bucket. I got to unhitch the mules and feed 'em. Put some water on the stove to boil. There's coffee in the blue tin on the shelf. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The latch clicked into place with a sound of utter finality. Clara stood alone in the center of the room. The fire in the stove began to pop and hiss, throwing flickering orange light across the mud-chinked walls. She dropped her bag. It hit the dirt floor with a dull thud. She walked over to the bed and looked down at her children. Sam had his thumb in his mouth. Willa's face was flushed, but she was breathing easily. They were safe. They were out of the wind. Clara sank slowly onto the hard, packed earth of the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. She squeezed her eyes shut. She was in a cabin at the top of the world with a stranger who spoke like a gravestone. She didn't know if she had saved her children's lives or doomed them all, but as the cast-iron stove began to radiate its first wave of real bone-deep heat, Clara let out a long, ragged breath. She had survived the day. For tonight, that would have to be enough. Morning in the high country didn't break. It shattered. Clara woke to a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She opened her eyes to pitch darkness. Above her, the heavy roof timbers groaned as the wind battered the cabin. Beside her, Sam was curled into a tight, shivering ball. Willa was hot, her breath coming in shallow, raspy hitches. Clara pushed the heavy bear pelt down. The air that hit her face was a shock biting at her nose and the tips of her ears. She sat up, her joints aching from the brutal wagon ride the day before. Her boots, where she had left them near the bed, were stiff. She stood, her stockinged feet hitting the packed dirt floor. It was like stepping onto a block of ice. She fumbled her way toward the center of the room, her hands outstretched in the dark, until her knuckles brushed the cold iron of the stove. The fire had died completely. Gideon hadn't come down from the loft to stoke it. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. I need someone to keep the stove hot. That was the deal. She had failed on the first night. Panic, thin and sharp, spurred her into motion. She found the matches in a tin on the table. Her fingers were so numb, she dropped the first 3 before she managed to strike one against the iron. The sulfur flared, casting grotesque jumping shadows against the mud-chinked walls. She opened the stove door. Dead grey ash. She grabbed a handful of dried pine needles from a bucket, tossed them in, and laid a few split sticks over them. She held the match to the needles. They caught with a smoky hiss. She slammed the iron door shut and blew on her hands, watching the faint orange glow flicker through the draft vent. A heavy thud from above made her jump. Dust drifted down from the ceiling planks. A moment later, Gideon's boots appeared on the ladder rungs. He climbed down backward, moving with a heavy, deliberate slowness. He wore the same woolen trousers and thermal shirt he had worn yesterday. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the door, grabbed his coat and rifle, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn blackness. A blast of frigid air swept into the room before the door clicked shut. He hadn't said a word. Clara stood by the stove, her hands shaking as much from the silence as the cold. She filled the kettle from the water bucket, breaking a thin layer of ice on the surface with the tin dipper, and set it on the heat. 30 minutes later, the door opened. Gideon ducked inside, bringing the smell of wet snow and fresh blood with him. In his left hand, he held 2 skinned rabbits. They were stripped of fur, the meat a glistening raw red in the lantern light. He walked to the table and dropped them on the rough wood. They hit with a wet slap. "Salt's in the crock. Cast iron pan is under the stove," Gideon said, wiping his bloody hands on a rag hanging from a peg. He turned his back to her, taking his rifle apart to clean it. "Lard is in the tin." Clara stared at the dead animals. The smell of raw meat and copper hit the back of her throat, mixing with the soot from the poorly drafting stove. Her stomach heaved violently. Back in Chicago, meat came wrapped in brown paper, already butchered. "I don't—" She swallowed hard, fighting the nausea. "I don't know how." Gideon stopped running the oiled cloth over his rifle barrel. The silence in the cabin stretched out heavy and expectant. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, his eyes were flat. "You cut 'em into pieces," he said, his voice devoid of patience. "You put lard in the pan. You fry 'em till they ain't bloody. You feed your kids." He turned back to his rifle. Clara's jaw tightened. The reprimand was clear. She wasn't a guest. She found a heavy knife on the shelf. The handle was carved bone, the blade stained and razor sharp. She approached the table. She closed her eyes for a second, listening to Sam begin to stir on the bed. Then she brought the knife down. The blade crunched through small bones. It was a sickening sound. Her hands became slick with blood and grease. She didn't ask for help. She cut the meat, her cuts jagged and clumsy, and dropped the pieces into the sizzling lard. By the time the twins were awake and crying for food, the cabin smelled of fried meat and burnt grease. Gideon ate his portion, standing up directly from his tin plate, staring out the single small window at the falling snow. He left the cabin before the sun fully cleared the ridge, leaving Clara with 2 crying toddlers, a bucket of bloody water, and the terrifying realization that this was the rest of her life. By the 3rd night, the cabin felt smaller. The walls seemed to press inward, the heavy logs absorbing the dim lantern light and giving none back. Willa's fever hadn't broken. It had settled into a dry, radiating heat that left the toddler limp and unresponsive. She wouldn't eat the rabbit stew. She barely drank the water Clara coaxed past her cracked lips. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, a damp rag pressed to Willa's forehead. The rag dried out every 10 minutes. Sam was asleep at the foot of the bed, exhausted from crying. Above her, the floorboards of the loft creaked. Gideon was pacing. He had been pacing for an hour. It was a heavy, restless sound, like a caged animal testing the bars. Clara dipped the rag into the metal basin on the floor. The water was lukewarm. She wrung it out her hands raw and chapped from washing clothes with lye soap earlier that day. She placed the cloth over Willa's eyes. The child let out a weak, breathy whimper. "Hush, baby." "Hush," Clara whispered, rocking her upper body. Fear was a cold lump in her throat, making it hard to breathe. In the tenement, fevers like this took children in a matter of days. You called for the doctor, but he only came if you had silver. Here there was no doctor. There was only the wind. The ladder groaned. Gideon descended. He didn't wear his boots, just thick wool socks, but his steps were heavy. He stopped a few feet from the bed. He stared at the wall above Clara's head, deliberately avoiding looking at the sick child. His jaw muscles were jumping. "She ain't sweating," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "No," Clara said, her voice cracking. "She's burning up. The water isn't helping, because her pores are shut." Gideon finally looked down. His face was a mask of rigid tension. Clara saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. He hated this. He hated the sickness. It was suffocating him. He turned sharply, grabbed his heavy coat from the peg, and shoved his arms into the sleeves. He jammed his boots on without lacing them. "Where are you going?" Clara asked, her voice rising in alarm. "It's pitch black outside." "Water buckets low," he muttered, grabbing the wooden pail. He didn't wait for her to argue. He threw the heavy door open and vanished into the howling dark. Clara stared at the closed door. He had run. The realization hit her with a dull ache. The stoic mountain man couldn't stand the sound of a dying child. She turned back to Willa, tears finally hot and stinging in her eyes. She gathered the toddler against her chest, pressing her own cool cheek against the burning skin. "I'm here," she whispered into the tangled hair. "Mama's here." An hour passed. Then 2. The stove began to die down, casting long, menacing shadows. Clara didn't move to stoke it. She just rocked. The latch clicked. Clara jerked her head up. Gideon stepped inside. He was covered in snow, his beard frozen stiff. He carried the water bucket, but it wasn't full of water. It was full of dark, wet bark. He slammed the door shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. He walked to the stove, shoved a log into the coals, and slammed the iron door. He grabbed a small iron pot, dumped a handful of snow into it, and threw the bark in on top. He set it directly on the hottest part of the stove. "What is that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Willow bark," Gideon grunted, stripping off his frozen coat. Had to dig through 3 feet of drift to find the lower branches. He didn't look at her. He pulled a wooden stool close to the stove, watching the snow melt into water, watching the water turn a muddy, yellowish brown. The smell hit the air a few minutes later, bitter sharp and intensely medicinal. When it reached a rolling boil, he grabbed the pot with a thick leather pad and poured the dark liquid into a tin cup. He set it out in the snow outside the door for 2 minutes to cool it down, then brought it back in. He walked over to the bed. He held the cup out. "Make her drink it." Clara took the cup. The liquid smelled like dirt and rotting wood. "What will it do? Break the fever, or it won't," Gideon said flatly. "But it's all there is." He took a step back, retreating to the shadows near the table. Clara lifted Willa's head. "Sweetie, drink this." Willa turned her face away, whining in protest. "You have to force it." Gideon's voice came from the dark, harsh, unyielding. "Pinch her nose. When she opens her mouth to breathe, pour it in. Don't choke her, but don't let her spit it out." Clara looked at him, horrified. "I can't." "Do it, Clara." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, stripped of all politeness and loaded with raw necessity, galvanized her. Clara braced herself. She pinched Willa's small nose. The child struggled a weak, thrashing movement, then opened her mouth to gasp for air. Clara tipped the cup. The bitter tea went in. Willa gagged, coughing violently, dark liquid spilling down her chin onto the pelt. But she swallowed. "Again," Gideon ordered. They did it 3 more times until half the cup was gone. Willa was crying a miserable, exhausted sound, turning her face into Clara's chest to escape the cup. "Enough," Gideon said. Clara set the cup down. She was trembling so violently she had to clench her hands into fists. She wiped Willa's chin with the rag. Gideon walked over to the shelf, picked up a heavy wool blanket, and tossed it onto the bed. Wrap her tight. Don't let the cold air hit her. Keep her under. Then he turned, climbed the ladder, and disappeared into the loft. Clara wrapped the blankets around the child, sealing her in. The weight was agonizing. The wind howled outside. The fire popped. An hour later, Clara felt it. The dampness. She slipped her hand under the heavy wool. Willa's undershirt was soaked. The child was sweating profusely. Clara pulled her hand back, pressing her fingers against her own lips. The skin was cool. The suffocating heat was breaking. Willa's breathing deepened, evening out into the rhythmic pull of true sleep. Clara slumped forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the mattress. She didn't cry. She was too empty for that. She just breathed in the smell of wood smoke and sour fever. Sweat listening to the creak of the loft boards above, knowing that the man pacing up there was just as haunted as she was. The snow didn't stop for a week. It piled against the walls of the cabin, creeping up past the single window, until the only light in the room came from the kerosene lantern and the open door of the stove. Willa recovered. By the 5th day, she was sitting up, demanding bread, and terrorizing her brother with a wooden spoon. The return of the children's energy was a sharp contrast to the suffocating stillness of the cabin. For Clara, the days blurred into an endless cycle of heavy labor, hauling water, boiling water, scrubbing clothes on a ridged tin board until her knuckles bled, sweeping dirt from a dirt floor, baking hard, dense bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven that weighed almost as much as Sam. Gideon was a ghost who occupied the same physical space. He left before light to check his trap lines, returning hours after dark. He spoke only to issue instructions. Wood needs stacking. Flowers got weevils sifted. Keep the boy away from my traps. He provided, but he didn't care. It was a transaction. Clara had accepted it. On the 8th day, Gideon returned early. It was mid-afternoon. He kicked the door open, dragging a massive hindquarter of an elk across the threshold. The meat was dark red, the fat yellow and thick. The sheer size of it made Clara take a step back. "Winter meat," Gideon said, hauling it onto the heavy oak table. The wood groaned under the weight. "Needs salting today. It'll spoil if it sits." He grabbed his skinning knife and a small hatchet. For an hour, the cabin was filled with the wet, tearing sound of meat parting from bone and the sharp thwack of the hatchet-splitting joints. He worked with brutal efficiency. When the meat was reduced to large, manageable slabs, he stepped back. He pointed to a heavy burlap sack in the corner. "Rock salt. Rub it in. Every inch. Don't miss a spot or the rot gets in." He walked to the wash basin, cleaned his hands, and went outside to tend the mules, leaving her with a mountain of raw flesh. Clara dragged the heavy sack of salt to the table. She opened it. The salt wasn't fine. It was coarse, jagged crystals the size of pebbles. She plunged her hands into the sack and scooped out a pile. She grabbed the first slab of cold meat and began to rub. It took 5 minutes for the pain to start. Her hands were already wrecked. Days of lye soap, freezing water, and dry heat had left her skin chapped, cracked at the knuckles, and split around the cuticles. The coarse salt acted like broken glass, tearing the fragile skin open. Clara gasped as the salt hit a deep fissure on her thumb. It felt like holding a lit match. She pulled her hand back, trembling. She looked at the door. Gideon was out there. She looked at the meat. There was so much of it. "I need someone to salt meat." She gritted her teeth. She plunged her hands back into the salt. For an hour she worked. She didn't let herself stop. When the pain became too sharp, she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. The meat was cold, making her fingers stiff and clumsy, but she forced the salt into the grain of the muscle, turning the red flesh a dusty white. The door opened. A gust of wind blew snow across the floorboards. Gideon stepped in, carrying an armful of split pine logs. He dropped them into the wood box with a loud clatter. He brushed the snow from his shoulders and turned toward the table. He stopped. Clara didn't look up. She kept her head down, rubbing the salt into the last slab of meat. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Gideon stepped closer. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the burlap sack of salt. The edges of the sack where Clara had been reaching in were smeared with bright, fresh red. Gideon's gaze snapped down to her hands. Her knuckles were split wide open, the blood mixing with the white salt crystals, turning them a pale pink. Her skin was raw weeping and covered in fine, angry lacerations. "Stop," Gideon said. Clara flinched, dropping the meat. She instinctively hid her hands behind her back like a child caught stealing. "I'm almost done. There's only one piece left." I said stop. Gideon's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a heavy, vibrating authority that demanded obedience. He walked around the table. He didn't ask. He reached behind her back and caught her wrists. He pulled her hands forward into the lantern light. Clara turned her face away, humiliation burning in her chest. She hated that he was seeing this. She hated that she couldn't do the one thing he had asked of her without bleeding all over it. Gideon stared at her mangled hands. His thumb, rough as sandpaper, brushed lightly over a split knuckle. Clara hissed in a sharp breath. He dropped her wrists. He walked away from the table toward the shelving unit in the back corner. He rummaged through a wooden box, pulling out a small, dark tin. He walked back and slammed the tin onto the table next to the bloody salt sack. He popped the lid off. Inside was a thick, yellowish paste that smelled strongly of pine pitch and old fat. "Bear grease and pine sap," Gideon said. He didn't look at her. He stared at the wall. "Wash the salt off in the basin. Dry 'em. Coat 'em in this. Thick." Clara looked at the tin, then up at his rigid profile. "I can finish the meat." Gideon finally turned his head. His pale eyes locked onto hers. The look in them was dark, complicated, and entirely unreadable. "You trying to prove something, widow?" "I'm trying to pay for my keep," Clara said, her voice shaking, though whether from pain or anger she couldn't tell. "I don't take charity." Gideon let out a short, harsh breath through his nose. He leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the edge of the table. "You think destroying your hands does me any good? You think I need a cripple hauling water tomorrow?" The pragmatism of his words hit her like a slap. It wasn't about her pain. It was about her utility. "You're a fool," Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You feel pain, you stop. You don't work through it up here. The mountain doesn't care if you're tough. It'll just take the blood and ask for more. Dead hands don't work." He stepped away from the table, turning his back on her. He walked to the stove, picked up the iron poker, and jabbed viciously at the burning logs. "Wash your hands," he ordered, his back still turned. "I'll finish the meat." Clara stood there for a second, her blood dripping onto the dirt floor. She wanted to yell at him. She wanted to throw the tin at his head. But she was too tired. She walked to the basin and plunged her bleeding hands into the cold water. The sting brought tears to her eyes, blurring the sight of the giant man standing in front of the fire, staring into the flames as if searching for something he had lost a long time ago. The silence of winter didn't end with a grand declaration. It ended with a drip. It started in late March, a slow, agonizingly repetitive plink of melting snow hitting the tin flashing above the doorframe. Then the heavy sod roof began to weep muddy water onto the packed dirt floor. The world outside transformed from blinding frozen white to a brutal churning soup of grey mud and rotting pine needles. Cabin fever had settled into the logs like dry rot. 4 people trapped in a single room for 4 months. Clara's hands no longer bled. The bear grease had done its work replacing split skin with a thick yellowish layer of callus. She could lift the cast-iron Dutch oven without wincing. She could chop kindling without her shoulders burning. She had become hard. She felt it in the way she moved, the way she no longer flinched when the wind screamed down the chimney. Gideon was worse in the thaw. The deep winter had kept him busy with survival. Now, with the trap lines largely empty, and the snow too rotten for snowshoes, but too deep for the wagon he was trapped inside, he paced. He sharpened knives that were already razor-thin. He oiled his rifle until the cabin reeked of sulfur and grease. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the tension finally snapped. Clara was at the table kneading dough. The rhythmic push and pull of her palms against the floured board was the only sound besides the dripping eaves. Sam was on the floor near the stove, playing with a collection of smooth river stones Gideon had brought in for him weeks ago. Gideon sat on his stool, a heavy piece of harness leather, across his lap, pushing an awl through the thick hide to repair a snapped rein. Sam abandoned his stones. He toddled over to Gideon, his small boots slapping against the dirt. He stood by Gideon's knee, watching the sharp steel point of the awl pierce the leather. Gideon ignored him. He always ignored the children, stepping around them like inconvenient pieces of furniture. Sam reached out a chubby, dirt-streaked hand toward the awl. "Don't touch that." Gideon growled, his voice a low vibration in his chest. He didn't look down. Sam retracted his hand, but he didn't leave. He stared at a smaller, bone-handled carving knife sitting on the edge of the stump beside Gideon. Before Gideon could shift his weight, the boy's hand darted out and grabbed the blade. "Sam, no!" Clara dropped the dough, lunging forward. Gideon moved faster. His massive hand snapped out, clamping over Sam's wrist like a vice. The boy shrieked in shock, dropping the knife. It clattered against the dirt. Gideon didn't let go immediately. He stared at the small wrist trapped in his scarred, lethal fingers. Sam's face crumpled his lower lip, trembling as a wail built in his lungs. Clara froze halfway across the room. She expected Gideon to yell. She expected him to banish the boy to the bed. Instead, Gideon slowly released his grip. His chest heaved once. He reached down, picked up the knife, and shoved it deep into its leather sheath on his belt. Then he bent over and picked up a scrap of raw pine from the kindling pile. He pulled a different, blunter knife from his pocket. "Sit down," he ordered the boy. Sam tears, pooling in his eyes, dropped onto his bottom in the dirt. Gideon didn't speak. He just started peeling thin, curled ribbons of wood off the pine block. The blade made a soft, rhythmic shh sound. Sam's crying stopped. He watched the wood shavings fall like snow onto Gideon's heavy boots. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the knife. Clara stood perfectly still, flour drying on her forearms. Gideon stopped carving. He tossed the chunk of wood into Sam's lap. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a blocky, vaguely equine shape with 4 stubby legs and a thick neck. A mule. Sam grabbed it. A massive, gap-toothed smile broke across his face. He made a small whinnying sound and began marching the wooden mule across the dirt floor. Gideon didn't smile back. He picked up his leather harness and resumed punching holes with the awl. But as he worked, Clara saw the rigid lines of his shoulders drop. The frantic, caged animal energy that had gripped him all week dissipated. That night, after the twins were asleep, Clara sat by the stove, A torn woolen sock stretched over a wooden darning egg. Gideon was in his usual spot, staring into the open door of the stove, an unlit roll-up cigarette pinched between his fingers. "You didn't have to make him that," Clara said quietly. Her voice sounded loud in the quiet room. Gideon didn't look at her. He needed a distraction, better than him losing a finger. Clara pushed the needle through the wool. "He likes it." A log shifted in the stove, sending a shower of orange sparks up the flue. "House used to be quiet," Gideon murmured. It wasn't a complaint. It was a flat statement of fact, spoken entirely to the flames. "Before you came. Too quiet. Heard my own blood pumping in my ears. Drove me half mad." Clara stopped stitching. He had never spoken about his isolation before. Not like this. "It's not quiet now," she offered cautiously. Gideon finally turned his head. The firelight carved deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks, highlighting the stark geometry of his face. He looked at her, really looked at her, his pale eyes tracking over her flower-stained skirt, the rough calluses on her hands, the tired slope of her neck. "No," he agreed, his voice thick and rough. "It ain't." He turned back to the fire. He didn't say another word, but he didn't climb up to the loft either. He stayed in the chair until the coals burned down to grey dust, sharing the warmth and the noise of her breathing until dawn. By the second week of April, the trail to Oakhaven was clear of snow. Clara stood in the yard holding a wicker basket of wet laundry. The air smelled sharp and green, laced with the scent of wet pine bark and thawing earth. Far below, through a gap in the trees, she could see the valley. It looked green. It looked like civilization. Her stomach clamped down into a hard, cold knot. The deal had been for the winter. Keep the stove hot so I don't come back to a frozen house. The frost was gone. The stove barely needed to be lit during the day. Her utility had expired. She walked to the rope line strung between two massive ponderosas and began pinning up Gideon's heavy shirts. Her hands moved mechanically. She had saved exactly nothing. Gideon provided food and shelter, but no coin. If he drove her down the mountain today, she would be exactly where Josiah Miller had left her, only with rougher hands and worn-out boot soles. She heard the heavy tread of the mules before she saw them. Gideon emerged from the tree line, leading Clementine and Barnaby. They were hitched to a drag sled, loaded with fresh-cut timber. He hollered a command, and the mules stopped their sides, heaving steam, rising from their damp coats in the cool air. He unhitched them, slapping Barnaby's rump to send him toward the corral. He walked toward the cabin, pulling his heavy leather work gloves off. He stopped when he saw her at the clothesline. "Trail's open," he said. Clara's fingers tightened on a wooden clothespin. She didn't turn around. "I saw. Wagon can make it down by tomorrow morning. Mud's thick, but the axle will clear the ruts." Clara closed her eyes. There it was. The dismissal. It was practical. It was expected. So why did it feel like a heavy stone dropping straight through her chest? She shoved the wet wool over the line and pinned it aggressively. "I'll pack the bag tonight. Wash the blankets." Who said anything about packing? Clara froze. She turned around. Gideon was standing 10 feet away. He wasn't looking at the mules or the trail. He was looking directly at her. His face was a thunderhead, dark and intensely coiled. "The winter is over," Clara said, her voice defensively sharp. "I kept my end of the bargain. You don't need a fire kept. I won't stay here and be a beggar in your house." "You ain't begging," Gideon snapped. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, heavy strides. He stopped so close she could smell the sweat and pine sap rolling off his skin. You work harder than any man I ever hired. You think I'm hauling you back to Oakhaven so you can scrub floors for some drunk at the saloon. Then what do you want? Clara yelled back, the months of pent-up terror and exhaustion finally boiling over. I am not your maid, Gideon. I am not a squatter. You told me it was a business arrangement. The business is done. I changed my mind. He said it so flatly, so stubbornly that it stopped Clara's anger cold. She stared at him, her chest heaving. Gideon looked down at his boots. His massive hands flexed at his sides, opening and closing in a rhythm of deep internal frustration. When he looked back up, the anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic she had only seen once before, on the night Willa almost died. I go into that cabin right now, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. And it smells like baking bread. There's a wooden mule on the floor. There's a tin cup with a bent rim on the table. If you leave, I have to go back in there and sweep out the dirt and burn the wood, and it'll just be me and the walls again. He swallowed hard. It looked painful. I ain't a good man, Clara. I'm rough. I don't talk right. I don't know how to raise a boy. I sure as hell don't know what to do with a little girl. He took a half-step closer. But I know how to shoot straight. I know how to pull a living out of this rock. I can keep you fed. I can keep them safe. Clara felt a tremor start in her knees and travel straight up her spine. Gideon, marry me. The words didn't sound romantic. They sounded desperate. They sounded like a man grabbing the last frayed rope over a deep black gorge. Not a business arrangement, a marriage, legally, before the magistrate in Oakhaven. My name on them. My land yours. Clara stared at him. She looked at his scarred hands, the dirt ingrained in the lines of his knuckles. She thought of Josiah Miller, neat and clean in his bowler hat, spitting on her boots. She thought of the brutal, agonizing nights in this cabin, and how Gideon had scoured the mountain for willow bark in the pitch black. He wasn't a hero. He was a broken, difficult man. But he had never once lied to her. You said you didn't want a wife, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. I was a liar, Gideon said bluntly. He reached out his movements, stiff, hesitant. He didn't grab her wrists this time. He just laid his heavy, warm palm flat against her cheek. His thumb, rough as a rasp, brushed a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. Stay. Clara leaned into the coarse texture of his palm. She let out a long, shuddering breath. It tasted like damp earth and melting snow. The heavy protective walls she had built around her heart over the last 5 months didn't shatter. They just slowly, quietly unlatched. All right, she said, her voice grounded, finding its strength. I'll stay. Gideon didn't smile. He just closed his eyes, his broad shoulders dropping 2 inches, as if a 100-pound sack of flour had just been lifted off his back. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. It wasn't a delicate embrace. It was a shelter. And as the spring wind howled through the ponderosa pines, Clara finally wrapped her arms around him, holding on just as tight. The mountain doesn't ask for perfection. It only asks for the strength to survive and the courage to stay. Clara and Gideon found both in the hardest place on earth. If their raw, unforgiving journey from a cold transaction to a grounded, fiercely protective love struck a chord with you, please hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates a romance built on grit, not just promises. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, untamed frontier stories delivered right to your feed. What would you do in Clara's boots? Let us know in the comments below.